wait. Okay, well, let's talk about the Virgin Queen. Looks rather dead. So, for a large part, this was, the game that I've been waiting on so much for so long. I loved Here I Stand. It was really the first CDG that I picked up, and it still is my favorite of them at this point. It's the first one that I picked up and started playing and saying, not just, that's a good game, that's kind of fun, I like that. I had some of those feelings even with Twilight Struggle. Some of the, yeah, that's kind of cool. But Here I Stand just said, wow, damn it, these are great. These can be fantastic. These can be like the old Dune or Empires of the Middle Ages to me. I can really get into them. So, with this, and I picked it up. I picked up Here I Stand fairly late. With this, almost immediately I knew about its existence being in preparation, and I said, I want this. I mean, Here I Stand to me is rated at a 9, which is shocking for how few plays I've given it. It could deserve a 10 in the long run, but I haven't gotten the chance to play games much. I get a lot of time to play games, but I don't get a lot of time to look at any particular game and play it again and again. And that one actually was perhaps the last game that got any kind of serious looking at before I've just started getting swamped with, geez, there's 10 years that I gotta catch up on, and then some old stuff that I always wanted that I could pick up, and then, there's Euros too, Anyway. I guess the big question is, did this live up to the expectations that I had for it? And, that you're gonna have for it as well, I assume. And also, on its own, how does it stand? Component-wise, why don't we start there? The least important thing, right? You got this nice solid map, and if you look at the views of it, I don't want to try to spread it out too much, but it's distorted. And that's an intentional situation to try to fit everything in it without using inserts, without making it too ugly. Very, very disconcerting when you first look at it. But the designer puts it as, trying to give a view of the world in Philip II's mind. And it really succeeds in doing that, with the Netherlands just hugely important. So much of his effort was directed there. England as well. France is important. Spain is important. Italy. But as you go eastward, the world starts shrinking and becoming less and less important. And then when you go, to the New World, of course it becomes much, much more abstract. And I think it works. There can be a problem with these little stand-up counters if you choose to use them, making it difficult to see everything that's on the board. There's also those counters are a serious problem in this game. In a way, they haven't been for me in any other GMT game that used them. The little plastic stands are a little looser than they usually are. I don't know if this is just, my game was questionable or if all of them. Anyway, a little piece of paper helps with that. But here's another one. And this probably is there for Here I Stand too, but Here I Stand was the first game I played that had these pieces. And I had mixed feelings about them then. Since then, I've kind of grown fond of them in most of the games that I've played with them. They really help direct, hey, here's where the important dude is, That's where the army is that I've got to worry about more. And I think that's a helpful focusing point in a game. But in this one, with multiple players, etc., it may be more important to focus in that way. But I think it's easier to lose sight of something on the map, at least for some of the people, because you've got so many different angles coming in. You can't just position it so that everything's visible and useful to everyone. Worse though, you've got these stacks of different shaped counters that happen on the board. And those guys, especially with the loose stands now, are constantly toppling over. And I find myself reaching over, knocking them over all the time. I think I'm going to probably not play with them with this particular game. Which is fine, because in their wisdom, GMT provided a set of, flat counters for people who would prefer that, and that works very well. Another thing, even though there's a huge quantity of player aid charts, and that's an issue with this game, you've got to be paying attention to stuff that's all over the place. It requires more of that than Here I Stand does, and really maybe more of that than any game that I've seen of this kind of scope. Which is to say, this is something that you can probably play in a good gaming day, a long one, but your 6 to 8 hour game. But it's requiring, being able to view an amount of material that I'm used to in these huge war games, where you've got a lot more time to be figuring out all the different pieces that you need. So, certainly early on at least, realizing where you have to look to find things is going to be painful. The rule book is lacking a major factor, which is the index. I'm assuming somebody's going to come out with one and it'll be online and available to people. Not much help to me, because I won't print it out and use it, but I don't have a printer. Not anymore. But what ends up, it's very hard to find specific issues in the rules because of that. And there's a lot of little pieces in this game, in terms of lots of little systems. Here I Stand had the same issue. I think this game is actually a little bit more complex. So one of the things that really made me happy when I first looked at this was, CDGs have been going in every single direction that they can. Let's make cards work this way. Let's try to figure out a different means of movement and combat and interception, different ways in which points are expended and everything. It's exploring in all different directions. And that makes picking up a new CDG much harder than in general picking up a traditional wargame would have been. And a game like this, and some of the other heavier CDGs, is very hard to fit into the same kind of mold in the way that a wargame would. Wargame is, at least the traditional style, would tend to follow the same kind of rules everywhere. In this, a lot of the flavors built in those little special aspects. So, I'm not sure that has to be the case across the board, but it's kind of nice to see many of the same systems transferring directly from one game to another. So if you like Here I Stand, if you're used to it, you can pick up a lot of this without really having to learn a lot more. The basic movement and combat, the cards, the way the activations work in this, which is very different from many CDGs. Actually, what I wanted to compare the CDGs to, because they're not really war games, at least something like this isn't. Some of the CDGs are, but I wouldn't call this one. This one feels more like, and games I was pushing forward for, things like Dune or Kingmaker, that I don't really consider war games. See my Wimp game list for that. But Unlike those games, this is a heavier game. There's more complexity, there's more little systems, there's a lot going on here. So that in order to tackle it, you really do need the kind of discipline of dealing with rules, and obviously I don't have that right. You know, it is my first look at the game, and but I do have the experience with Here I Stand, and you'd think I would have picked up more easily. Well, there are a lot of little differences here. And one nice little example that someone pointed out to me with the religious conversions. Now, they went out of their way to change the way religious conversions worked. They used to work like everything else. You roll bunches of dice, you aim for 5s and 6s, and the guy who gets the most wins, you know, and has his effect. Well, instead of working on 5s and 6s, now they're going on 4 5s and 6s, but you can hit multiple spaces in one roll. It works, but it adds another little piece, okay? Another little thing to remember. Likewise, there are things that were hard to dig out of the rolls. You could remember them, but they might not be easily found in all those player aids, etc. And you look through them all, and you look through the charts in the back, and you realize, I don't have the answer here. And then you have to start paging your way through the rulebook. One example, the race-built galleons. Yeah, it ends up, it's right at the front of the rulebook. Not exactly where I would have expected the only reference to, well, actually it's buried also in a combat rule. But essentially, what their effect was. You forget how something works, it's much harder to dredge out what the answer is. That's not a big deal if you play the game a lot. If you've played a few games of it over the course of a year, I'm sure almost all of it's going to be pretty much old hat to you. But if you're like me and you tend to pick up a game and say, yeah, I liked that, and I haven't played it for a couple of years and play it, it's going to be troublesome. There's no question. If you were someone who found Here I Stand to be maybe taxing the limits of what you wanted to see in a game, and I think it's taxing, actually, well, maybe this one is, the limits of what a CDG can almost handle. Because you've got a huge deck of cards in this game. How much more, can they put in a box and still sell it at a reasonable price? But anyway, if you thought Here I Stand was kind of taxing what you could handle, you might want to be a little forewarned about this. This is, I think, a little bit heavier game. But on the bright side, if you already are able to cope with Here I Stand, you're going to get most of that for free, because most of the base systems are the same. There are some big differences, though. There's this intrigue system, which I didn't really explore much in my game. It didn't feel like it had a huge effect. There's the patronage, which isn't terribly complicated, although I managed to screw that up as well. But seems to have great value in the game. In fact, the player who won by playing that off. One of the things one of the things with Here I Stand is that every player, there may be a lot of rules, but every player almost has their own set of rules they have to worry about largely. So yeah, the Protestants and the Pope have to worry a little bit about military rules, but largely they're concerned with the religious rules, and pretty much everyone else can ignore the religious rules, right? Well, in this, nearly every rule system affects every player, and the things that are really, really tailored to one player tend to be very important to understand in terms of what that player's chance of winning at any particular time is. So in particular, the rules the Protestants have, basically having 2 powers and kind of a weird victory point handling between them and stuff like that is all very unlike everyone else. Well, everyone else has to kind of have some idea what's going on with those Protestant points. Everybody takes value, or at least, what, 4 of the powers take value from how many Protestant spaces there are. This again is different. Before, 2 people were worried about that. Those 4 powers, well, 3 of the 4 are interested in the religious warfare. But there's another player who's not interested in the number of Protestant spaces, who is interested in the religious warfare, and one who's interested in the effects of the religious warfare but can't really do much about it. There being the Holy Roman Empire. And I really don't know if it makes any sense for the Empire to ever pick anything but the balanced choice. So there's this, they get this secret decision at the beginning of the game. And that's kind of cool, except nobody else has anything like it. Everybody else's victory points are all out in the open. It may give them a slight edge, mainly in the realm of players who aren't terribly familiar with the game, might be surprised by how well the Empire's doing and let them get away with a win that they wouldn't otherwise. Of course, it may also be that the Empire might also be new to the game and not notice that they've got to win when they do. I was a little disturbed by what felt like their disengagement, the Empire's, in most of the game. And I know this was vaguely an issue because apparently one of the playtesters, or I don't know what to call them, but someone who was helping at Beach designing this in some way with suggestions, brought out what ended up being the Empire's, some of the ideas that the Empire took according to the designer's notes. Now, if that's the case, I mean, the thing is that the Empire is already feeling very, very detached. And it's almost as if some rules were maybe tacked on with that surprise additional Protestant points, or additional points based on the religious warfare, etc., to give them a chance. Anything else might have destabilized the game. But they really do feel like they're playing off in their own little world that's mainly about artists and very little about what's going on in Europe. They're not involved very much in exploration of the like. And likewise, the Turks aren't all that involved either in this. It's almost as though, see, and here I stand, the English felt a little off to the side. Here, they still feel a little off to the side, although I'm sure if that enterprise of England takes place a little earlier, they can feel more at center stage. One thing that it does maintain, though, that Here I Stand did very, very well with, is this, oh no, so-and-so's in the lead, or doing very well, let's bring them down. You can bring them down, maybe, but there's always this teetering balance. The game's almost ready to end. It looks like somebody's got a good shot, and you've got to all jump on them and stop them. Maybe not every single person, but at least you have to not make it hard on the people who are trying to stop the leader. And I really liked that dynamic in Here I Stand, and that feels like that it carried over into Virgin Queen. The tension and someone being able to put a challenge on the game for a victory at almost any stage of the game. Not always the same person. Early in the game, Spain looks like they have a lot of power that way. But we saw France had it early week where they might have been able to do it. Later, England almost got there. France looked like they were shooing in for the end of the game victory. And it ends up someone else wins. You know, a lot of dynamics going on where you really don't know for sure how it's going to end, where the players have a lot of ability to stop things. There may be a decent amount of luck going on in it. Between the die rolls, which I think kind of neutralize it, they're not terribly luck based because it's a big buckets of dice type thing. Generally that's going to even out, but it comes down to one roll, right? I mean, a lot of battles, a lot of important actions come down to one roll-off, where if you get better than average luck in your favor, you could win a battle that's just key that would be very bad for you to win for the other people. You know, they could give you the game, essentially. So, overall, when I look at it, you know, Here I Stand was a total classic. And it shifted my view of CDGs heavily. It, I think, had a huge effect on the gaming world as a whole, especially on CDGs, where you see things. I mean, it's not the first multiplayer. Successors was out there for quite some time, but it put a different kind of dynamic where sort of Rome kind of follows the same idea here. And I think this one nails it down and really gets a lot of the same feeling that Here I Stand had. However, the simple fact that it's not the one groundbreaking, shaking game means that it doesn't shift my world enough that I'm probably gonna give this an 8, whereas I had stuck with a 9 on Here I Stand. This might be a better game, but I can't tell that right away at this point. It would take significant more playing to really see that. One thing that's very clear, though, is in a two-player game, you have to really worry about balance. Here, clearly there are different points in the game where it's going to be very much balanced in favor of one person or the other if people just follow certain kinds of patterns. So early in the game, Spain has a lot of advantages. But those advantages are going to erode fairly quickly. And later in the game, well, England's got the ability to accrue a lot of victory points over time, as does France, even worse. So it almost seems like a balance shifts in another direction if the game can be kept alive long enough. And it looks fairly likely the game is going to be kept alive long enough. But as we saw, someone with the least power kind of in terms of being able to influence the rest of the world, etc. Someone who really, when they made their early stab at the game, just got smacked down hard and fast and easy by one other power, right? I mean, the Ottomans took the empire down really in one turn. Well, they still managed to pull off a win. They just couldn't do it in the militarily, dominating type position. And there's a mixture there. I mean, I like the way the balance and the tempo and the flow of player interaction for the win goes. I really do like that aspect of the game, but I don't really like the separation that some of the people have from the rest of the world's concerns. It almost may be a better game. I'm not sure. I haven't tried, obviously, since this is my first play. I haven't tried anything in less players. The game supposedly will support anything from 2 to 6. In some cases with multiple powers, but a 4-player game, for example, just knocks the Empire and the Turks out of the game. And since they're kind of fringe players anyway in the 6-player game, it might be a more engaged game for the main powers to be using them as pawns in that major struggle. Now they're kind of interesting pawns because they get their own hand of cards to play, which is kind of an intriguing idea. When you activate one of those 2 powers in the multiplayer, in the smaller than 6-player game, you get to play it out as an actual power. I think Sword of Rome had a similar mechanism in it, but I don't believe Here I Stand. maybe I'm confusing things. Anyway, I don't think, if you really love Here I Stand, there's no way you're going to be terribly disappointed in this. It is a different step. It does make some different directions. But I think it adds to that experience. The one really sad thing for me is there's no way in hell you can link the two games. I had been hoping, maybe build up a Here I Stand based Europa Universalis type thing. It doesn't work. You might be able to maybe design a system to move from the scenario that ends the game in Here I Stand to play a game of Virgin Queen as a setup thing, some kind of weird optional role. But it's just not going to work because of the CDGs factor. You get a certain branching factor in Here I Stand. Well, what if Edward's the King of England? This game doesn't work anymore. It's not the Virgin King, right? It's just it is reliant on the idea of particular personages being in power at a particular time. One thing I found kind of, this is just sort of an aside that probably should have been stated earlier, the whole royal marriage thing. Early in the game, it kind of kickstarts the diplomacy. When players kind of would want to just sit back and maybe pad their own nest, well, maybe they can get bought into some of these bigger issues, or at least give some diplomatic support in exchange for a marriage, in a way that they wouldn't be interested if not for those cards. But at the end of the game, those cards stop being there. They stop having any real importance, which feels a little funny, but I think it works. Anyway, overall, I'm not at all disappointed in the game. I couldn't have expected it to hit me the same way as Here I Stand does. So, yeah, I'd say it does a pretty good job of holding up the franchise, as it were. And it would be kind of interesting to see if more games based on this system might be coming out. There's certainly, room for the kind of depth that this covers, as opposed to most of the CDGs, especially the multiplayer ones, seem a little lighter. I think this one still hits that sweet spot. The only danger is how much can you stretch people? Here I Stand was a stretch for some people. This may have been one. This may be the step too far to have that kind of popularity that'll just keep printing out new versions that are tailored to their time period. This is definitely well tailored to its time period. Anyway, up this goes.